Jeffrey Tucker is a prominent Bitcoin commentator and a widely lauded economic educator. He's sought after across the globe for his insightful opinions, ideas, and occasionally subversive ideas. He's a key participant in the strategic conversation about Bitcoin and where it's heading. And he's an enthusiastic proponent of liberty and freedom in financial exchange. But at the core, Jeffrey is a libertarian and an educator. And today, he channels a great deal of his energy as CEO of the organisation Liberty Me, which is a social and publishing network for the liberty and open-minded individuals. He's valued for his deeply insightful ideas and comments. And if I just share a few of the titles of books that Jeffrey has authored in recent years, it'll give you an idea of how interesting this man is. He's the author of Bourbon for Breakfast. Sounds like a great way to start the day. Another book, It's a Jetsons World. Another, A Beautiful Anarchy. And his recent upcoming book is Liberty.me. Liberty is a do-it-yourself project. We're delighted that Jeffrey has found the time in his very busy schedule to travel all the way from home in the United States to join us for the conference in Melbourne today. He fortunately will be sticking around for the conference, so we'll have the opportunity to explore some of the areas that he'll be covering in this talk during our panel discussion later today. But for now, please welcome to explore the broad world of Bitcoin, where it is, where it's been, where it's going, what's possible. Please welcome Jeffrey Tucker.
Have received the invitation to come to Australia. Of course, it's fabulous for Americans to come here. This is my second trip in the last 6 months. Last time I was in Brisbane. It's my first time in Australia, and I absolutely fell in love, and it's just great. And Melbourne's even more spectacular than Brisbane, I think, so far from what I can see. So it's very exciting to be here. In so many ways, Australia is just spectacular, really, compared to the US. Everything's sort of new and unusually prosperous. Everything works. I don't know if you know this, but in the U.S., everything's sort of vaguely getting worse all the time. Everything from the police state to the water technologies to, food regulations. And everything is kind of weirdly falling apart in the U.S. And I don't have that sense in Australia. It's exuberant and fun and exciting to be here. So I'm very pleased for the invitation. You are very much to be commended for having shown up to this event at all. It's a small crowd, but the important thing to remember about all new technologies is that they're adopted only by a minority at first, a minority that's very insightful and attached to the future, thinks outside the mainstream. Early adopters of technology are the people who are always shaping the future. It's never the majority. It's never the masses. It's always a tiny number of people that really understand and are intensely curious about new things. You can think of yourself as maybe the way early adopters of electricity in the 1880s, thought, or early adopters of the automobile in the early part of the 20th century, or early investors in the railroads in the late 1860s, early 1870s. That's how significant Bitcoin is. It's a game changer. Many people have commented, and I agree, that's the most important innovation since the internet. It might be the most important innovation in the last 100 years for many, many reasons. And I want to talk about some of those today. It takes a great deal of intelligence and insight to understand something like Bitcoin. Right now, it's a very complicated technology. People are afraid of it. The media is getting ever more interested in it. And of course, the reporters have no clue even where to begin the discussion. They don't even know what questions to ask. I typically begin my interviews by telling reporters that Bitcoin is magic internet money, just to sort of cater to their worst fears about what's really going on. Sort of breaks the ice that way, in a way. So it's a complicated technology, but everything's complicated at the beginning. And railroads were complicated. Electricity was scary. If you've ever been to the United States, there's a town called Newport, Rhode Island, that has all these beautiful mansions. They're built by the so-called robber barons of the period. These are the richest most heavily capitalized group of Americans during this emergent period of prosperity in the Gilded Age. And it's always very interesting to me to tour the mansions and see, who among the entrepreneurs were the early adopters of electricity. I mean, many of them were afraid of it. They thought that if they put electricity in their homes, first they couldn't figure out why you would need it. Like candles work just fine, My gas lamps are perfectly suitable. What's the point of this electricity? It's excessively risky. It's expensive to put in. You don't know if it's just going to blow up and start your house on fire instantly. And it's untested technology. But there are a handful of these entrepreneurs that actually did wire their homes with electricity. It's very expensive and very edgy. And they turned out to be on the cutting edge. And this is how great entrepreneurs think. They adopt new technologies when nobody else thinks they really matter. And there's the same thing with railroads and cars. And it's been the same thing with the internet. I remember 1995 when the internet was privatized for the first time. And we started to see new companies come along. Companies like Amazon. And I remember very well how they were debunked. There was a column in the Washington Post by David Broder that came out a year after Amazon was founded. And he said, this company is never going to work. This is ridiculous. Nobody really wants to buy books online where you can just go down the street and buy them. This is a pointless technology. It's never going anywhere. And as soon as they succeed, somebody will just copy the technology and put them out of business. So there's absolutely no hope for this. Of course, we all know that Washington Post columnists are smarter than entrepreneurs, right? Yeah. So this is the kind of thing that went on. And look, it was the same thing with Facebook. Everybody said, well, this is idiotic. I mean, what possible market could there be for people's faces to appear on a page and share it with others? I mean, this is just stupid. And it was the same thing with Twitter. 140 characters, you can't say anything in that amount of time. This technology is going nowhere. And so on it's been for the entire digital age. And look what happened in 1999, right? We had a kind of a boom in a lot of internet companies, and then a bust happened, and many of them went out of business. And so the debunkers of the internet were all walking around for about 6 months acting as if they had been great prophets of the future. And many people were burned in 1999. Well, if you had any smarts about you, you would have bought in 1999, not bailed out of the sector. And so all those people who were burned, or believed they were burned by the dot-com bust, lost out on vast investment opportunities over the next decade and just completely missed out on the future. And it's still going on today. I remember the first time somebody sent me a link to Google and said, hey, this is a pretty cool search engine. And I sent it to somebody else. They immediately wrote back and said, look, this is an idiotic name. I mean, a search engine shouldn't be called Google. I mean, that's just stupid. Nobody's going to take it seriously. It's not going anywhere. We should all be using Alta Vista or whatever was the big thing at the time, right? So, what I'm telling you is that, what's happening in Bitcoin today is exactly what's happened to every other great technology in every company. Everybody's putting it down at first, but, the really great entrepreneurial minds stick with it. They innovate. They see something amazing. And then the world has changed. And then afterwards, everybody forgets. That's what's going on with Bitcoin right now. So you're to be commended for being here. Let me mention to you just right up front something I think is extremely important to understand about Bitcoin. And I say this because it's a source of confusion. It's why people have a hard time talking about this subject, and why it's kind of like a brain twister, like a mind bender. Like you can't get your brain, well, you have a hard time explaining it to people. And I think the fundamental reason is this. Bitcoin consists of two gigantic innovations combined into one. This combination doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet and doesn't exist anywhere else in history. And the two giant technologies are, on one hand, a payment system. And by payment system, I mean like PayPal or credit cards, or a system where you exchange cash one with another person. Anything that facilitates trade one with another person is a payment system. It's both a payment system on one hand, and then on the other hand, it's a money, or it's a currency, or it's an emerging currency. It's a commodity. And these two features of Bitcoin are all united into one technology. Nothing else like this exists anywhere else in the world. So if you understand that, you'll be on your way towards understanding what Bitcoin is all about. And if you forget that, you will lose track of what Bitcoin is and why it matters. So that's my fundamental lesson to you. If you can just remember that, just rolling two critical technologies into one single tool, then you understand why Bitcoin is so different. In the future, people are going to forget this. In fact, even now, it's a little confusing because I think we saw a slide earlier that had cheap fares, this airline company that sells airline tickets with Bitcoin. When you go to payment options, it says, well, what do you want to pay with? Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, or Bitcoin. So you just click the radio button, which one you want, and it gives the impression that these are all kind of equal technologies, but they're not. I mean, all the others are just payment systems tied to national monies. Bitcoin is a payment system tied to a money that's completely independent of the nation state. It's a money that was invented out of ones and zeros only 5 years ago. It's a different money and it's a different payment system, all combined into one thing. So if you get that, you'll know more than 99.9% of all the masses, and certainly most all reporters who are talking about this subject. And I want to talk a little bit later about why it matters that these two things are combined. In fact, if they weren't combined, Bitcoin's value would be absolutely zero. That's right. I mean, if you take away the payment system from Bitcoin, it's just as worthless as any other stream of code. It means absolutely nothing. So, now let me just right up front, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk first about present controversies about Bitcoin. I want to go through some of the history and the theory of Bitcoin, the structure, which I hope you'll pay attention to that section, because it's a little bit confusing, but I think I can help get you where you want to go. I want to talk about the future of Bitcoin, states of adoption, some other issues there, and then finally end with the extended uses of the blockchain that's part of Bitcoin, because actually, in fact, Bitcoin is only the beginning of what this technology is going to mean for our future. I mean, it's just the monetary feature of what is a much larger and immense global revolution taking place right now. Very few people are talking about it, but I would like to end talking about 20 years from now, basically, and what this all means. Okay, first of all, if I can ask, has anybody in this room actually used Bitcoin for a transaction before? Okay, so we've got a few people. I think it's really important, if you want to understand Bitcoin, to actually use it. And I say that because I spent about 2 years trying to think about Bitcoin abstractly. Somebody had sent me articles. I was at that point an editor of a big financial monetary website. And people were trying to get me to publish articles about Bitcoin. And we're talking about maybe 2010, even 2009. And I'd get these articles and I'd read them, and they were enormously confusing. I mean, just filled with all kind of technical detail I couldn't understand. Oh, the blockchain and cryptography and peer-to-peer exchange networks, and it just seemed like a bunch of blah, blah, blah. And I tried to read it. I would read the Wikipedia entry. I would read, all the protocols. I even looked through the code myself. I could never get it. And so I wouldn't publish an article about it because as an editor, the most important thing you can do is you pretty much have to understand every article you publish. Like as an editor, you don't want to actually publish something you can't figure out or can't defend. So I never published an article on Bitcoin because I couldn't understand it. And that all changed for me. It was actually early 2013. So we're talking about only about 14 months ago. And I was at an event in New Hampshire, and apparently about 5 or 6 Bitcoiners, people really heavily involved in the industry, had already conspired before the conference began to surround me and convert me to the cause, right? So when I got to the conference, they seized on me. And I got away as quickly as I could because I thought that's the last thing you want is to be surrounded by a bunch of Bitcoiners and, hectored for a weekend on this topic. Because as I say, it was very confusing to me. But finally, I made the mistake of kind of showing up at the lunchroom by myself, and that's what they actually surrounded me, like practically carried me and set me in a booth. And I thought, then promised to pay for my lunch with Bitcoin. I thought, well, okay, for a free lunch, I can sit with these weird geeks for an hour, right? And then they had me download a wallet on my phone, and one of them purchased the bow tie right off my neck, and paid me, I think now, 3 Bitcoin for my bow tie. It was a very expensive bow tie, actually, if you think about it now. But at the time, that wasn't that much money. That was more or less retail. And I'll never forget the feeling, because the appetizer hasn't even come yet. And I felt my phone just sort of buzz. I looked at my wallet, and I saw 3 Bitcoin suddenly in my wallet. And I had a sudden sense that, okay, wow, this is amazing. Something really weird just happened. He transferred something that was in his phone to my phone, and it left his phone, it came to mine, and now I'm in a position to transfer this out to somebody else. Doesn't matter if I'm at lunch with him. There could be anyone, anywhere in the world I could do this to. It would the transfer itself would only take a couple of seconds. The confirmations might take 5 or 10 minutes later, but you can act on the existence of the property on your phone even before the confirmations come in. And I realized, okay, this is weird. We've just transferred value from one person to another without using any third party. That is bizarre. And I realized that something amazing was taking place. Because, I mean, of course, the person could have sent me a PayPal, right? But PayPal is not actually money. It's just a signifier that some sort of payment of money is intended at some point in the future. It's a promise to pay, basically. But with Bitcoin, the payment was already done. And I checked his phone to make sure that actually the Bitcoin left his phone and entered mine. Because it's a little funny in the internet, right? I mean, if you send an email, like if I have an image on my iPhone and I send it to you, it doesn't take it off my iPhone, right? I don't suddenly look at, hey, where'd my image go? Well, I gave it to that guy, right? No, it makes a copy, right? So I wanted to make sure that he hadn't somehow made a copy of his Bitcoin and that it really had transferred. And he showed me his phone, and I looked at it and I said, my God, how's this even possible? So then that's what sparked the curiosity. I got home from the conference. I couldn't stop thinking about the subject. I began to read more about it, and now it started to make sense. A lot of times you can't understand things until you become a real owner of them. Like the knowledge is too abstract until you become a physically possessing of the property. You have some stake in the outcome of a subject. Otherwise, it can just be a bunch of blah, blah, blah. And you've probably experienced this yourself in trying to explain Bitcoin to people. They really don't care until it begins to actually matter to them. And then they come back to you and say, hey, you were sort of boring me to tears a few weeks ago with a tedious discussion of something I didn't care about. Now suddenly I care about it. Can you tell me the whole thing over again, actually? This happens all the time. So I began to look into it and fell in love with the technology. To understand Bitcoin, you basically have to understand about 5 things. You have to understand the value of digits, which I understood that already. You have to understand something about monetary theory, which I understood that already. You have to understand something about distributed networks. I was getting the hang of those. You have to understand something about open source software development, which I had been involved in for years, so I got all that. The one thing I didn't really get was cryptography. So I was kind of scared of the topic. So I put it off about a day and then embarked on a massive study of cryptography. That was the last piece. And once I got that, then the whole payment system and the money began to make sense. And I couldn't stop writing about it. And I guess it was about this point last year. I think it was about middle of March. I wrote an article that was so over the top with excitement about Bitcoin. And I predicted that by the end of the year, it would be $1,000. And even people within the Bitcoin community were slightly embarrassed for me. That's crazy. That's not going to happen. And really, very weirdly, the world kind of fell in on me that day. I had so many critics. I mean, there were dozens of people writing articles denouncing me for my irresponsible prediction and my outrageous comments. And that, who am I working for? Who's paying me to say these things? Well, I wasn't working for anybody. I was just a commentator, you know, seeing with price trends and understanding what was happening. No, you might say it was a lucky guess, and it probably was. It worked out for me rather well. But, I mean, I was denounced by former colleagues, you know, people I thought, you know, were understood my sincerity anyway. No, I mean, the attacks were unrelenting. And then that's when the press began. And I've written, meanwhile, about 50 to 75 articles on the topic and followed the thing very closely. I've spoken probably at another dozen Bitcoin conferences. I held my, my own conference in October in Atlanta because it was about June last year, and it was weird to me because I discovered this new technology. I thought, this is unbelievable. I've never seen anything like this. Why isn't there big conferences going on about this topic? I mean, why aren't people gathering? Why is everybody ignoring the most exciting technological revolution of our times? This is very weird. As I say, this is like ignoring railroads in the 1870s. You know, it's like ignoring electricity in the 1880s. So I just decided to hold my own conference and put together a bunch of experts. I had to convert people to Bitcoin just to find speakers, actually. I would call people up, and it was so fun because I would call people up on Skype and say, listen, you're a smart person, you need to know about Bitcoin. No, okay. Well, download this wallet, pick a password, write it down, don't forget it. Now hold your phone up to the camera, and I'm going to transfer some to you. So they'd hold it up to the camera. You know, you just scan the QR code, press one button, boom, it arrives. And it was a beautiful thing always to see their face, because they're like, whoa, that's weird. What just happened? And I would say, well, what just happened is the future. I want to give you a couple of days to think about it, and let's talk again. So then I give them a couple of days, call them back up, and say, what do you think? And they said, my mind's blown. You know, I'm never going back. I want to know more about this. I've thrown myself into massive study. So at that point, I would say, well, how about this? You study this topic between now and October and come and speak at my conference. It was the way I got speakers for my event. It was the only way I could get them. And it's fun because all those people who I invited are now like me, totally obsessed, right? Thinking about the topic, you know, all the time. About present controversies. It's very interesting to me because most of the time right now in Bitcoin, when you read about it, it's websites and newspapers whipping up some sort of frenzied hysteria about something having gone wrong. You know, like price volatility is a funny one. I mean, the price volatility. I mean, this is a nice problem to have, actually. It was only February 2011 when the Bitcoin exchange rate with the US dollar reached $1. $1. And there were people who were holding tens of thousands of Bitcoins from having mined them. And they said, my God, this is clearly a bubble. I'm going to sell everything I have. And they did. Yeah, this is what happened. Because nobody expected the Bitcoin would actually become equally as valuable to the dollar. And then it was about this point last year, it was early in March, when Bitcoin went from $12 at the beginning of the year to $30. And there was a tremendous hysteria. Oh, there's a bubble. Bitcoin cannot and should not be $30 a piece. We know this because we just know this. You know, this is a presumption. People expect that they know. This is a bubble. So it's going to crash. Well, you know, over the next 6 weeks to 2 months, it reached $240. Those were insane times, right? It's really fun to be part of a market that's going crazy. Literally hysteria breaking out all over the place. Like you'd go to bed and wake up suddenly at 2 a.m. and think, I wonder what the price of Bitcoin is. Then check your phone and it's gone up $50, you know? And you're like, wow. And so then you go back to sleep and you wake up in the morning and it's up another $50. It was great times to be alive, right? And it reached, I think, about $260. Clearly there was a frenzy. It was the middle of the Cyprus thing that Jamie talked about earlier. There's a little bit of a frenzy going on. That's what happens. And then, then of course, there's a crash. So the price began to fall and fall and fall, and it reached down to $80. And it hit $80, and all the world press said, Bitcoin is dead. So much for Bitcoin. Bitcoin bites the dust. Well, never mind that just a few weeks earlier, you know, it was $30 and everybody was declaring it a bubble. Now the bottom of the market is $80. And you'd think that people would observe that that's more than doubling of the price, but for some weird reason, we have strange minds. We imagined this was a crash, not a gigantic actual increase, which it in fact was. And the same thing is happening right now. You know, we reached 1240, 1250, something like that at the beginning, at the end of the year. Yet another kind of wave of hysteria. You know, markets do this. And now the price has fallen back down. I think last I checked it was about $500. You know, I can easily expect that we're going to see another price run up that's going to best the last highs. This is the way Bitcoin works. It's kind of a staircase. It does a giant leap and then falls back to about half. And then it does another giant leap and falls back to about half. So the next, it'll leap up to about $1,800 probably in the next price run up. And then it's going to fall back to about $1,400 is my expectation. And then everybody's going to once again declare Bitcoin to be dead. Bitcoin bites the dust. And then I'm going to get cameras shoved in my face, people demanding for me to account for its outrageous price volatility, you know. Well, hey, yeah, Bitcoin's volatile. If it scares you, don't use it. Don't bother with it. You know, let those of us who care about it actually play with it. You know, there's a long period of price discovery. And you know when this period of price discovery is going to end? Never. It's going to go on forever. Bitcoin could be $100,000, it could be $500,000, it could be $1 million. As you know, there's always going to be price volatility, and that's beautiful. It's called the market at work. The market reflects human valuations. People are valuing Bitcoin, and thank God for that. It's not governments are not controlling the price. If you look at the Bitcoin market, you're seeing a pure free market at work. And if markets scare you, well, become a monk. You know, dig a hole 6 feet in the ground and throw yourself into it. You know, if that's what makes you happy, fine. You're scared of markets. You're scared of life, as far as I'm concerned. Volatility is just part of life. No one day in this world is like the previous day. Everything is different. Everything is changing, and thank God for it. And that's why we get up in the mornings. That's why we wake up. That's why we're investors. That's why we care, because of change. Change is beautiful. I'd rather have price volatility than fixed prices in a static universe where nothing's improving and everything's falling and everything's becoming worse all the time. I love the price volatility. There's nothing wrong with it. How does that affect things in terms of the Bitcoin market? I don't think it actually affects things that much. The most sophisticated Bitcoin users I know never even check the prices. In fact, there's a little bit of a snobbery about that, actually. It's a little funny. You talk to the hyper Bitcoin geeks, the people that are dealing with the code and know it all the time, and are the other core developers of Bitcoin. You talk about the Bitcoin price, they'll kind of brag, I have no idea what it is, you know, with a kind of snooty, that's for the hoi polloi, you know. I know its future and it's going to be great. No, for my part, yeah, I check it every 10 minutes, but anyway. The other big controversy, well, there are a lot of controversies about Bitcoin. I mean, the Mt. Gox situation was really a very interesting one because, I mean, those of us in the Bitcoin world were aware of the problem of Mt. Gox for about 2 years. I mean, it was a funny situation because Mt. Gox came about. You know what Mt. Gox stands for? It stands for Magic the Online Gathering Magic the Gathering online exchange, right? So Magic the Gathering was as one of these silly little games that people play. And I don't know that much about it, but apparently, so, you know, there are a lot of games that people play. You know, you dress up like Dungeons and Dragons or something. I don't know what. You get together and play roles, and so Magic the Gathering is one of these things. You know, sort of the nerds that everybody makes fun of in high school and college. You know, they played Magic the Gathering, and to win at the game, you get little trading cards, and that worked just fine when you're in physical proximity to each other. But there needed to be some way to exchange these trading cards across geography. You know, what if you're not playing with people in front of you, you're playing online? You had to have some way to exchange them. So Magic the Gathering began as a kind of trading exchange for these rewards that come with this nerd game. And then it was bought by the present CEO, I guess. I don't know if he's still CEO, but for a very low price, because he was a real Bitcoiner and was really interested in Bitcoin. But he was very young. I mean, he was like in his early 20s or something like that. And at that time, you know, Bitcoin just wasn't that big a deal. I mean, it just very few people cared about it. There's no way you could get this many people in a room in Melbourne, Australia, talking about Bitcoin. There was just a tiny sliver of the population that cared about it. He found himself in a weird situation. He was the CEO of what eventually became a major international exchange for the edgiest technology on the planet. And he just got over his head very quickly. I mean, I can give you a version of what happened at Mt. Gox. I can't guarantee that this is absolutely true because nobody knows for sure. I'm not even sure that the top-level employees at Mt. Gox know for sure what happened. But apparently early on, there were security problems with their exchange and they were hacked. And a lot of their Bitcoin were actually stolen from them. And they didn't notice this for a very long time. By the time they did find it, they patched some of the holes. And if any of you are involved in technology, you know that security is a huge deal. You never quite get it right. You have to think about it every single day. Hackings happen all the time. It's just the way it goes. And their technology was just not robust enough. And when the hacking was discovered, they fixed it, but came to terms with the fact that that they had a problem, but didn't reveal it to anybody because what they're hoping to do is pay back the hacked Bitcoins with new purchases of Bitcoins and replace what they had lost through the price run-up. And then they got hacked again, and it started looking a little bit grim, but the price is still running up. And there's a real fear of actually letting investors know what was going on. There was a lot of irresponsibility. I'm not sure I would call it outright fraud, but it was radical mismanagement because they had pooled their Bitcoins anyway. So when you actually got your Bitcoin, they were attempting to just dig out of a big pool. It's just that the pool had shrunk, so they couldn't pay out everybody all at one time. And then at some point, they got heavily, heavily fined for failing to file the right regulatory forms in the US. The US has one of the most heavily regulated Bitcoin markets in the world, actually. I mean, just to get into the money exchange business in the US requires at least 6 figures, like up front. And they had not filled out all the proper paperwork, so they got heavily fined, so they lost a ton of money that way. And things got worse and worse. There was apparently a shadow investor that attempted to bail them out last April. But I'm telling you, what Jamie said was right. For 2 years, anybody in the Bitcoin space has greatly regretted not just Mt. Gox's dominance of the industry, but its very existence. People were desperate for this company to go out of business in the Bitcoin world. That's why when a couple of months ago, or whenever it was, they finally sort of recognized reality. Everybody in the Bitcoin space was cheering. I mean, we were all popping champagne corks and going, yay, finally Mt. Gox is dead. And it was hilarious to all of us to read the headlines in the paper the next day with all these anti-Bitcoiners going, oh my God, Bitcoin is dead. Bitcoin bites the dust. Bitcoiners never expected this to happen. I gave a whole series of interviews where I said this is the greatest thing that ever happened, actually, to Bitcoin thus far, getting rid of this incompetent company that has no idea what's going on. I mean, I'm sympathetic to these guys. I mean, I would not have wanted to have been the CEO of that company at the age of 23 or whatever. I mean, it was a dreadful sort of situation for him. But this is also, again, the market at work. If you look at the early age of desktop computers, I mean, what was the top desktop computer in 1980, say 1983? Does anybody remember? The Commodore 64? Very cool machine. But hardly anybody remembers that the Commodore company 10 years later, after having made gazillion dollars in the industry, went totally bankrupt and got wiped out. None of the early computer manufacturers are even around today. And it's the same way with email providers. I mean, I remember CompuServe.com, as being like the great email provider. And of course, AOL. And we all know what we think about people who have AOL addresses. Embarrassing. If you still have one, change it right away. It'll hurt your business prospects sending AOL emails. So this is creative destruction. Now, what about and other issues like money laundering? So I have a friend of mine. His name is Charlie Schramm, and he's a really nice guy. In fact, he's the guy who actually brought me around to Bitcoin. He and his friends. At that New Hampshire conference. Very interesting guy. He's not ideological. He's not a monetary economist. He just has a really good nose for investment. and he saw Bitcoin as being an amazing technology. He jumped into the space very early on. Apparently, he had bought and sold some Bitcoin that 3 times removed eventually was used on the Silk Road, which is a kind of an online marketplace selling a variety of edgy products. Yeah? And so he was arrested recently for money laundering. Now, I don't know all the details of Charlie Shrem's business dealing, but I do know that this guy was like extremely attached to compliance issues. And all of his businesses with Bitcoin, he was extremely fastidious about adhering to regulations because he kind of more or less agrees with them, all right? So I don't really like these regulations. I'm a bit of an anarchist myself. So I always thought that he was a little too conventional for my taste. And so it's ironic to me that he was arrested for money laundering, spent like 3 days in jail, and now he's still under house arrest. But I have absolutely no doubt that he's going to beat this charge. I have no doubt. But when he was arrested, all the papers all over the United States, and it's so embarrassing, the coverage of Bitcoin is so embarrassing in the press. CEO of Bitcoin arrested. It's like nobody told the reporters that Bitcoin isn't a company. It's a technology, you know? So look, what I'm telling you is we're going to have to get used to this kind of nonsense headline. So yeah, money laundering and oh, God knows what else, you know, people are buying methamphetamine with Bitcoin. And so, you know, my answer to the money laundering charge, isn't it used for money laundering? Yeah, probably. The dollar is used a lot more for money laundering than Bitcoin, actually. You know, every currency is going to be used for money laundering because money laundering is going to be a feature of the world forever because governments tax the use of money. That's why there's money laundering. It's not because there are bad people in the world. Well, there are bad people. They're called government regulators. But it's the regulators that are responsible for the very existence of money laundering, not Bitcoin. It's so stupid. But look, I just want to give you a heads up here. You have to understand that between now and the next 100 years, most of the headlines that you're going to read in the press are going to be about scandals, business busts, criminals, drug lords. You know, it's going to go on like this. And you're going to read the morning paper as a Bitcoin fan. You're going to read the morning paper and have this sinking feeling, oh, God, here we go again. But this is the way every emerging technology works. Again, let me go back to the railroad analogy. If you go through any, and you can do this online now, go through any of the headlines concerning railroads between 1870 and, say, 1895. What are the headlines about? Stock market fraud, Royals Railroad Industry. Bridge breaks and railroad plunges into a river, killing hundreds of people. You know, another railroad company goes bust. Real estate fraud connected to railroad industry, and so on and so on. And this, every headline for 20 years was about the scandals and the upheavals and the disaster. You would never know from reading the press that we had just experienced the biggest upgrade in civilization in the history of humanity. The headlines never say that. The time reduction of travel from New York to Florida reduced by 5,000 times. Okay, that's never a headline. New populations suddenly get vegetables for the first time in their lives. You know, these are never the headlines. Massive prosperity unleashed by railroad industry. It's never the headline. It's always about the scandal. And it's going to be this way with Bitcoin. You have to learn to look past that. Okay, let me just move on to some history and some theory behind Bitcoin so we can understand actually where we came from. I don't believe there would be such a thing as Bitcoin were it not for the 2008 financial crisis. Now, it's true that for about the previous 20 years, people had dreamed of something called like a digital currency. They imagined the possibility that with the internet, everything might change and it might eventually affect money. But there was a serious problem that people couldn't overcome, and that was that the internet itself is a sphere of infinite reproducibility, and with money, infinite reproducibility is pretty much the last thing you want, right? I mean, if you have infinite reproducibility in money, you have basically the Federal Reserve, right? We don't want that. So Bitcoin was the first technology that really solved what's called the double spending problem, and I'll get to that here shortly. But The thing that gave the impetus to Bitcoin was the utter complete collapse or near collapse of the world monetary and financial system in 2008 because real estate prices had fallen 20, 30%, and all the world's major banks were overly invested in mortgage-backed securities, nearly toppling some of the most beloved institutions of the world. For my part, I wish they had all just gone out of business, not just Lehman Brothers, but all of them. But instead, the US government stepped in and saved them all. But what it did is it undermined confidence in the dollar system. And it was that inspired, as far as anybody knows, Satoshi Nakamoto to introduce, Satoshi, by the way, is the name of the person who invented Bitcoin. It could be a he or a she, could be a group of programmers, nobody knows for sure. The only thing we know for sure is that Satoshi Nakamoto is not a train-collecting retired physicist living in Los Angeles, contrary to what Newsweek magazine claimed in the world's most embarrassing story that came out about 3 weeks ago. I don't know if you saw that headline, but absurd, all right? We don't know who Satoshi Nakamoto is, and we probably never will know. Some people say that I probably have met him because he, we know he's still alive, actually, because he communicated for the first time in 4 years to deny that he's a train-collecting retired physicist and living in Los Angeles. But before that, we hadn't heard from him in 4 years. So we know he's still around, but we don't know his actual identity. But it was that led him to put out this white paper. And that came out October, I think it was, I don't remember the exact date in October, but it was 2008. And he proposed the idea of a new currency that would work peer-to-peer without a third party. And the Genesis block, the very first block of Bitcoin that was introduced into the world on the blockchain, came out early January 2009. It was very intriguing because it came about in a way that nobody expected. It wasn't introduced to the Senate Banking Committee. It wasn't introduced by Ben Bernanke at a press conference. It was never approved by any of the elites operating in any of the big foundations or think tanks. It was thrown open into a free-to-use file-sharing forum in which he dumped the protocol and said, here's my new cool money. If you like it, give it value. If you like it, try it out, see what happens. That's a weird way to cause a global monetary revolution. It's just very strange. Life has changed. The elites no longer control our future. They are not giving us our cool new toys. Everything is emerging from below. And Bitcoin is the best example of that. If you want to know the future, you have to watch what these crazy geek community is doing. Look to the cyberpunks and their radical ideas. They're the ones who are shaping the future. It's not Janet Yellen and President Obama, all right? They're just spokesman for the old order. It's people like Satoshi Nakamoto who are giving us our revolutions. So he put it out there, a unified money and payment system all at once in a protocol, and people began to examine the protocol. The value of Bitcoin when it was first released was 0. So there has no price attached to it. There was not a fixed relationship between Bitcoin and any monetary technology from any government in the world. It was unattached from national monies. It just said, here's my new commodity to that attached to a payment system. Try it. If you like it, go for it and see what happens. Fully 10 months went by before Bitcoin obtained its first value. So the question you have to ask is the one I asked that I couldn't understand. Where did this come from? And this is where people like Warren Buffett are confused. Where actually everybody's confused about it. It's like, how can Bitcoin have value? It's not based on anything. It's just this airy, weird magic internet money, as I mentioned earlier, built on ones and zeros. How can that have a foundation? How can that actually have a value? Surely it's going to evaporate. It doesn't mean anything. It's some sort of scam. It's a Ponzi scheme. Well, look. You have to understand the prehistory, how we got here from the beginnings of Bitcoin. There were 10 months where Bitcoin had 0 value, and suddenly on October 5th, it obtained its first price, which was something like 1/10 of a penny. As far as anybody knows, that was the first quoted price of Bitcoin. So how do we get from 0 value to 1/10 of a penny? For those 10 months, edgy, sophisticated people in love with technology were using the payment system itself to see how it works, to test it, to see if it lived up to its promise. So they would exchange Bitcoin back and forth, not for any particular valuation, but just to see if it actually worked. And it proved to be actually rather amazing, that you could transfer a ledger entry from one person to another person anywhere else in the world, and it could be instantaneously transferred back and entered onto this great ledger in the sky called the blockchain, which is always perfectly balanced, and there was never any double spending. The cryptography worked. You couldn't penetrate through the public key, private key system, so all transactions were pseudonymous. Most importantly, it started behaving like real property. And that was incredible, because nobody had ever seen in the whole history of humanity anything like this. It was very, very impressive. And it's almost amazing to me that it took so long for Bitcoin to actually get off and running, okay? Now, Carl Menger, in his History of Monies, describes a kind of similar process of evolving monies. First, things are used just as commodities, like gold or silver. They're valued because of their industrial use or because they're pretty as jewelry or whatever, but then they become the most marketable commodity and gradually emerge as money. I mean, he describes this process of taking 10 to 50 years for something like salt to become money, or for platinum or bronze to become money, or gold to become money. It's a long process of experimentation where people try it out to see if it works. And then it obtains its first price. So what are people looking for in a money? This is really a very interesting question. Like, what makes a good money? There are a number of features to it. There has to have uniformity between each individual form of money. This is why like shells don't work very well, because each shell is slightly different. But it's better than nothing. But it's why gold works really well, because all gold is uniform in quality. Another thing is you want something to be divisible. So it can be like an ounce of gold, or a half an ounce of gold, or a tenth an ounce of gold. Or you can combine the 10th ounces again into a single thing. But it's divisible and still maintains its integrity. This is why, for example, you can't like use a cow very well. You know, like you divide the cow, like it's not worth as much as it might otherwise be, right? So you want divisibility, and you want fungibility, so that every single unit is just like every other unit, so it doesn't matter which unit you happen to hold, it has the same value as any other existing unit. So you have that fungibility element. You have to have scarcity with money. As I mentioned to you earlier, if it's infinitely reproducible, it's as worthless as the leaves in the fall that fall from the trees, or as worthless as the dollar will be someday, actually. Or you know, the currency in the Deutschmark or the Reichsmark was in Germany at the Great Inflation. The more reproducible a currency it is, the less its value. So that's why gold has always been a beautiful currency, because it's scarce. So when we start looking at this payment system, well, what Satoshi did is he added 2 additional features to money that no money ever before in history had ever added. And that is 2 things. One is, and this is what's amazing, it's absolutely weightless, so it doesn't weigh anything. It doesn't weigh down your pockets, so you don't have to store them at the goldsmith or at the warehouse and get a paper ticket in exchange for it. You can actually transfer the real thing without having any kind of cumbersome weight. It also takes up no space whatsoever. So that's the beautiful thing about it. These are 2 additional features. Like if you were putting together the perfect money, yeah, you'd have divisibility and scarcity and fungibility and uniform quality and blah, 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 all these things. But you'd also imagine that it would take up no space and take up no weight. That would be the ideal money. So all of these features exist within Bitcoin, backed by this amazing payment system, all combined into a single technology. That is the source of its value. So when people ask you, and everybody will, why is Bitcoin valued? Just say, because of its payment system. If you take away the payment system from Bitcoin, it's worth absolutely nothing. They are absolutely united and integral into a protocol that's all one unified thing. There were 3 features to Satoshi's protocol. One was the payment system. The second was the coin itself. The third is a system of smart contracting that comes with the blockchain. And I want to end with discussing about that after I march through some of the rest of this. So that's something of the history. As I mentioned to you, it achieved dollar parity in February 2011. There wasn't a single Bitcoin holder or advocate in the world who expected it to achieve $1. This was a miracle taking place. It's unbelievable. I know for myself, I was a grave skeptic of all this stuff. I mean, to some extent, people are just skeptical of digits in general. I mean, we're already like 20 years into the digital age, and we still have doubts that it exists for some reason. We're still skeptics because, I don't know, because we're like, we believe things that are physical, and we're more skeptical about information. We're also the first generation of the digital age, right? We're going to be thousands of years from now, people are going to look back at us and wonder how we responded to it. You know, how skeptical were we of it? And they're going to laugh about the fact that we all doubted there was, you know, any merit whatsoever to Twitter or to Facebook or to Bitcoin. I had a funny experience happen to me recently with an economist I really respect. He's from South Africa, and he studied under the great Ludwig Lockman, and I had read many of his articles. He's an absolute genius in every area. Just a brilliant, brilliant man, a far higher IQ than I have. I adore him. And he wrote the world's stupidest article on Bitcoin. When it appeared, I was absolutely mortified. I mean, like, you know, head in my hands, kind of, oh my God, how did this ever get past the editors? This is catastrophic. And basically his point was, it's ephemeral, it's made of ones and zeros, surely it can't have any value, this is stupid, this is not the way money is. Money is rooted in physical commodities. I mean, forget the dollar, right? It's not rooted in any kind of physical commodity. It used to be, but it's not anymore. But he didn't get it because he didn't understand the value of code. So I called him up on Skype. I said, Frank, how could you have written this article? This is catastrophic. Do you not know anything about Bitcoin? And don't you think it's important to actually study something before you write about it? I mean, how could you say this? He said, well, I don't believe it because it's all just kind of nonsense. I can't even understand it. I mean, it seems to be just pure information. It's surely not real. So I looked at him, I waited for a few minutes, and I said, Frank, do you think we are having a conversation? He said, yeah, I think we are. I said, well, do you think it's a real conversation? I mean, do you think we're really talking to each other? He said, yeah, I'm pretty sure we are. I said, you understand, of course, that this is an illusion, right? This is all just code, that you're not really here in front of me, you know, that we're actually using digital media right now, and that we're nonetheless able to talk, and this is a very valuable moment for both of us. I mean, I'm valuing talking to you, you're valuing talking to me, and the technology behind this is kind of an unbelievable thing. This is like the Jetsons, you know? Do you get that? He said, yeah, I kind of get that. I said, well, okay, if you understand that, then you understand that Bitcoin can actually have value for the same reason. It allows people to communicate and transfer value on a geographically non-contiguous basis anywhere in the world instantaneously for free, for virtually free. You get that? No, I don't get that. Like he could get Skype, but he couldn't get Bitcoin. Okay, that's some of the history. The theory is a very interesting feature, and I know I'm going a little bit long because we've got a lot to cover here. Some of the theory behind Bitcoin is very interesting. You understand that we carry around with us certain illusions about money. Mainly because money has pictures, at least in the US, of politicians on it, right? And they're issued by governments. So we have this impression that governments are the makers of money. This is completely wrong, actually. No government can actually make a money. They can take over a money, but no money can originate in a government agency because government agencies are not capable of imparting value to anything. Quite the opposite. They take value away from things. That's mostly what governments have done now and throughout all of history. Money emerges from markets. It emerged first as a private sector innovation because of market trading. And you know that money is always in the process of emerging in small ways everywhere in the world. Some years ago, I was really honored and privileged to be present at a gathering of kids who had just gone out and collected Halloween candy. And they all came back with big bags, and they were going to trade with each other for what was their favorite candy. So I decided to perform a little social psychology experiment on them, you know, cruel as I am. So I put on a timer. I said, 30 minutes, you've got to trade. All of you dump out your bags and figure out what you want to do. Of course, they all began with barter, right? Snickers for Butterfinger, Butterfinger for Jolly Rancher, and so on. But after a while, the smartest kid among them began to realize what was the most valuable candy there, and he began to acquire it, not to consume it for himself, because I think it was Snickers. He didn't care anything about Snickers. But because he saw that other people valued Snickers, he began to trade his Jolly Ranchers in to get Snickers. And pretty soon he had more Snickers than anybody else. That was the single most valuable candy in that whole thing. Then he could get anything he wanted because he was able to trade his Snickers for all the candy he wanted. And then other people began to observe what he was doing, and they themselves began to get Snickers. And so Snickers, briefly in this period, true story, became a money in that little tiny microeconomy. Acquired not to consume, but to trade for other things. That's how money emerges in the world. It's not a consumption good. It's something you get just because other people value it. And as we approached the 30-minute mark, I said, we have 3 more minutes. It was a beautiful thing. I watched Snickers being demonetized in that little candy economy. Suddenly people were dumping them all over the place, right? For like any price. It was really fun. And then we ended the game, the bell rang, and the people who ended up with the Snickers were those who wanted to eat them, not those who wanted to trade them. And that was the end of the game. And none of the kids knew that they had just invented an uninvented money in the course of that 30-minute period. This is how it works. Several years ago in Maryland, in the United States, there was a big crackdown on cash. And this is a big problem for drug dealers because drug dealers like cash, actually. So the police were being very vigorous in arresting people with large cash holdings and all the rest of it. In the drug markets, the dollars were demonetized briefly, and people began to trade, this is a true story, large gallon-size containers of Tide laundry detergent. All right? So suddenly, all over Maryland, Walmarts were reporting theft of Tide laundry detergent. And they had to put like ropes and chains around the Tide aisle to keep people from stealing them. And nobody could figure out, like, why is Tide suddenly so valuable? Well, briefly in that one period, in that one slice of time, Tide had become a money to transmit value between drug dealers. This is a true story. So we see this all the time. In prison camps, oftentimes cigarettes become the currency, okay? So this is how currency emerges. And this is where Bitcoin comes from. It's the same exact situation. Not from a top-down solution, but from governments. Okay, I know that I'm running short of time, and it's frustrating for me. But let me just mention what I consider the 5 things that make up Bitcoin that make it truly valuable. So the first thing is that it's based on the internet. And again, we're still not coming to terms with the fact that history has changed forever. People always say to me, yeah, but Bitcoin can't be valuable because what if the internet goes down? Well, look, the internet has never gone down, like ever. That's one thing, all right? The internet is here to stay. It's never going anywhere. I mean, maybe a solar flare would come and destroy the whole thing. People say that to me. It's like, well, if that happens, we're going to have a lot more problems than just the brief, temporary demonetization of Bitcoin, I can tell you. The internet allows a global communication between any 2 people. By itself, the internet is a danger to the nation state. It unifies the world in a global communications system. And so it just cries out for there to be a money associated with it. Secondly, peer-to-peer. Bitcoin allows peer-to-peer exchange. And in that sense, as I mentioned earlier, it's unlike any other payment system in the world. You don't have to go through Visa, MasterCard, or anything else to exchange peer-to-peer. It means that there's no third parties. The most important third party that's cut out of Bitcoin transactions is the nation state itself. That's very, very beautiful. Because governments are famously the enemy of sound currency. The third thing is cryptography. Okay, cryptography allows you to exchange only the information with another person that you want to exchange, no more, no less. That's what it comes down to, and it anonymizes your transactions. Now, it's true that Bitcoin isn't perfectly anonymous, and it's not designed to be. If I post my Bitcoin address, my public address on my Facebook feed, send me Bitcoin, I've outed myself for that one address. How many Bitcoin addresses can you personally have as a Bitcoin holder? Yeah, infinite numbers. I have to point that out to you because people get a little confused. I mean, we tend to have like one email address or something like that, or one physical address. So we tend to think we can only have one public address for Bitcoin. Most of the modern services of Bitcoin now actually exchange your public address for every single transaction. And that's what Coinbase does, which is a very nice thing, helping to anonymize things. What's the purpose of cryptography? I mean, people think that the purpose of the anonymity associated with Bitcoin is so that we can buy methamphetamine or something and not get in trouble for it. That is nonsense. That's not true. The purpose is to allow us to only share the information that's relevant to the transaction and not give up any other information. Please understand that when you put your credit card into the internet, when you give it to iTunes or to Amazon or whomever you're dealing with, you're not just giving up a number to allow yourself to exchange cash with them. What you're doing is giving up the whole of your identity. Through that credit card number, you can have access to your entire spending history, your personal financial records, probably your health records, and probably your life itself. I mean, the incidents of credit card fraud are enormous. We lose hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and trillions are spent trying to protect us against it in the credit card industry. We are now trusting huge corporations to hold this data for us, and just hoping against hope that they're going to keep track of it. I received an email this morning from my own Visa company that apparently somebody yesterday tried to buy $618 worth of goods and services from Walmart with my credit card. It just happened just this morning. Now, how did they get my credit? They invalidated the transaction. They were suspicious of it because they said it was very interesting that he'd be in Melbourne today, but also buying $600 of goods from Walmart. So they didn't let it go through, but now my credit card had to be, this has all happened to you, right? You have to take the credit card out of commission, and they have to issue another one. This is the cost that's associated with using cryptographically protected technologies for our payment systems. Credit cards are ridiculous. They date from the 1950s. This is an anachronistic institution that's only been hacked to work in a digital age. It doesn't belong. We should not be using them. And they're going to be displaced by cryptographic currency because they're pathetic and they're dangerous and they're a high level of security risk. Because they always use, they don't use cryptography and they're not peer-to-peer. They use the internet for sure, but it's a hacked and pathetic system. Okay, the fourth thing is that Bitcoin works as an open source technology, meaning that there will never be a movement called Audit the Bitcoin. We all know what the code consists of because it's open and shared with the planet. Anybody can download the protocol. Anybody can copy the protocol and make a new Bitcoin. Right? It's a little bit strange. That's the way open source works. But what other open source technologies are there in the world? Wikipedia, anybody can edit it. It works, all right? 10 years ago, everybody was making fun of it. How stupid is that? An encyclopedia that anyone can edit, that's gonna fail for sure. Well, it didn't. Another open source technology is WordPress. It's the most commonly used website foundation for anywhere in the world. The Linux operating system is entirely open source. A few years ago, Samsung released Google's new open source technology for smartphones called Android, an open source technology that anybody can download and develop for. And people laughed at it and said, that's never going to anywhere. It'll never beat iOS's beautiful proprietary code, protected and guarded over by experts. No, that'll never work. Well, now it's the #1 dominant operating system for cell phones everywhere in the world. Open source is better because it accumulates the knowledge from a large community of users. So Bitcoin has an open source development system. There's a core of developers. Any of you can enter into that core of developers for Bitcoin if you're amazing enough to merit entry into that system. The beautiful thing about that is it allows Bitcoin to constantly improve. We don't know anything about this with money. Usually we're used to money becoming ever crappier every day. And that's basically what's happened over the last 100 years, because money was nationalized 100 years ago by governments. It's an anachronism. It's stupid. It's pathetic. It gets worse and worse every year. Bitcoin is just only going to get better and better. You do understand that from Satoshi's original protocol that was released in January 2009, only 25% of that original code still remains. All the rest of it has been rewritten and improved by developers. So it's constantly in a state of improvement. I mean, just as one example, under his original protocol, Bitcoin was not transferred to your public address, but to your IP address. That's a problem because that didn't allow for wallets to be carried around. You had to be sitting at your home computer in order to use your Bitcoin because it was tied to your IP address. There's other big problems with that system. It was quickly blasted away because people saw that was a failing of the code, and so it was improved to use cryptography instead. Fourthly, fifth, uses a distributed network. Distributed networks, of all the things that Bitcoin's, the building blocks of Bitcoin, the distributed network is the most amazing one of all. This is the great innovation. It's this distributed network that works off the blockchain. This is the great innovation right here. This is the number one thing. I mean, all these are important, but this more than anything else. The distributed network means that it can live simultaneously on any computer node anywhere in the world. You're probably carrying a node with you right now on your cell phone. You probably have 2 or 3 nodes at home with your home computers. Anywhere that there's a node, the blockchain can exist in its entirety, so that there are potentially trillions and trillions of copies of the blockchain anywhere in the world, and it can't be destroyed. If you have all the world's governments decide to hold a big plan to tomorrow destroy the blockchain, they could go around the world and smash computers one by one, trillions and trillions of copies of computers, so long as there's one existing copy of the blockchain anywhere in the world. It can be infinitely reproduced and replicated 1 trillion times over again. It's the ultimate indestructible technology. Put anything on a distributed network, and what have you done? You've eliminated the central point of failure. It can no longer be taken down. It becomes immortal. This is unbelievable, inconceivable, actually, in any other period in the history of the world, that you would have something like a distributed network. It's not just Bitcoin that exists on a distributed network, but any open source technology does. You can't get rid of it once it exists. And people are afraid. People are afraid of Bitcoin. They're like, well, what if my computer goes down? Well, look, there are ways around this. Like, what if I drop my cell phone in the toilet and it breaks? Well, if you haven't had another system to access your Bitcoin, then you've got problems. But what you should do is just pair your devices, essentially. In the case of somebody like Ross Ulbricht, my friend who's now languishing in jail because he's alleged to be the Dread Pirate Roberts, he's carrying all of his Bitcoin in a brain wallet. So he has something like a 45-character password in his head that allows him to have access his however many Bitcoins he owns. Maybe it's 200,000, we don't actually know. And as far as I know, he's not given up his brain wallet. And they can try to waterboard him to try to get his, but you can't actually speak very well, actually, if waterboarded, so it's probably not going to happen. He'll probably never give up his brain wallet. And let's say he spends 20 years in prison. The minute he gets out of prison, he can just open up his Bitcoin instantaneously with his brain wallet because of the distributed network. Everything that exists on the blockchain will always exist unto the end of time, thanks to the distributed network, and it can ultimately never be controlled. And this is the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. We're all interested in the subject of regulation. There's no question that Bitcoin is going to be regulated. It already is regulated. Last spring, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in the US came out with a 1-page, 8.5 by 11 thing that said, if you're a money exchange transmitter business in the US, you have to regulate as one. You have to file all the appropriate regulations and paperwork for one. That immediately put hundreds of companies and startups out of business because they couldn't afford to comply with it. Just one little sheet of paper, right? That's the way it works. Regulations are very damaging and threatening to Bitcoin in some ways. So they're very good for us to watch. However, they cannot ultimately threaten Bitcoin because governments can only control, in the end, the exchange between Bitcoin and dollars or any other currency in the world and dollars back into Bitcoin. It's the coming and going that is regulatable, but Bitcoin itself will never be regulated. It cannot be regulated. So the more regulations that exist, this is what's very interesting. This is where you need to really pay attention to this. The more Bitcoin is regulated, or the coming and going to and from Bitcoin, the more you incentivize people to get into Bitcoin and stay there. Like, why would you ever convert your Bitcoin back into dollars if by doing so you're going to pay a huge penalty for doing so. What you'd rather do is just stay within the Bitcoin ecosphere itself. So what I'm suggesting to you is that all attempts to regulate Bitcoin are going to backfire. They're actually probably in the end going to boost Bitcoin as a technology, because people will get there and stay there. And once you're into the Bitcoin ecosphere, you're ultimately not going to be controlled by anybody. There's nothing anybody can do about it. Okay, let's talk about the future. The rate of adoption is occurring at an unbelievable pace right now. A year ago, it was actually very difficult to spend Bitcoin. About a week ago, I just bought a plane flight. With Bitcoin, it wasn't a problem. Everything was great. Overstock.com, Jamie mentioned, is one of the edgiest companies out there. Founded CEO is a friend of mine, and he started accepting Bitcoin, and within the first 30 days, he had sold more than $1 million worth of goods and services with Bitcoin alone. Why would a company adopt Bitcoin? Well, not because they want to sell people illicit goods and services. Mainly, they just want a better payment system that doesn't charge them 4 or 5% per transaction. It's just, as a technology, it's much better. It's like way better. There's a big network effect associated with national monies. To get out of it, you have to have something much better. That's the way it always works. At any technological upheaval, that's what you need, is a much better technology to replace the existing one. Bitcoin is that much better, mainly because the transaction fees are so incredibly low. The only reason they exist at all is to pay the mining community that is simultaneously also the people that verify each transaction and enter them to the blockchain and make sure the blockchain is maintained. So Satoshi was not a communist. He saw that people needed to be paid for their work. And there's a lot of work that goes on to maintain the blockchain, and those people are paid for that. They're paid both in the form of fees and in new Bitcoin that comes from Bitcoin mining. By the way, I'm so charmed in so many ways by the language of mining. Satoshi had a great deal of respect for the gold standard, and he structured his protocol to replicate the gold standard and its history. So the first Bitcoins are very easy to get, just like it was very easy to pan gold in the gold rush of California. You could just dig it out of the rivers. Once that was gone, you had to dig a little deeper into the mines and into the mountains and pay ever more to do it. And right now, the miners, early on, it was very easy to get Bitcoin. Now, if you want to get into Bitcoin mining, you're going to be spending 25 to 35K just for your mining equipment, and it's gigantic, and it uses a tremendous amount of power. This is all designed to replicate the way the gold standard works. So anyway, the rate of adoption is from my perspective, if you're running a business and not using Bitcoin, you're missing out on an opportunity. Nonetheless, it takes a long time for businesses to discover things. For the larger corporations, it's a serious problem because their legal staff, their compliance officers, their accounting divisions are very confused and slow-moving and just bureaucratic. That's why most of the adoption rate is taking place among small vendors and upstart firms. Secondly, and this doesn't concern anybody in this room so much, but it's very important for our future, and it's going to mean a lot for prosperity in the future. You do understand that not everybody in the world has a bank account, right? And that not everybody in the world has a credit card. And that a lot of these people, nonetheless, have a lot of skills and talents, and they want to buy things and they want to sell things. So what happens to them? Under the current system, there's a wall between us and them. They're basically excluded. They're externalized from the global matrix of exchange and prosperity. They cannot contribute. They cannot buy, they cannot sell. They're just left to languish, and they're forgotten about. How many people are in this category? Well, probably about 2 to 2.5 billion people in the world. That's a lot of people who are excluded from the current system. Why are they excluded? Because they don't have a bank account, they don't have a credit card, or they live in the wrong IP address. If you run an internet business, you know this. You want to sell to people in Belarus, you want to sell to people in Nigeria, you want to sell to people in Uruguay, you probably cannot do it because the risk is too high. You have to block ranges of IP addresses from your system because there's too much fraud that takes place. And it's a cruel system. It's wicked. I mean, having run many internet commercial sites myself, I know the feeling of what it's like to block a IP range and to say to that whole population that lives there, sorry, you can't buy from me, I will not send to you. It's a wicked and cruel world because of the cartelized, government-run system. Billions of people are being excluded. Bitcoin represents for them total liberation on one hand from having to depend on large banks and large institutions, credit card companies, and on the other hand represents an inclusion into the world economy. You remember that before the Iron Curtain was lifted on Eastern Europe and before reforms in China, there were billions of other people that were not allowed into the world economy either. But once those systems collapsed and those governments collapsed, they were newly included. That's a major reason for the prosperity of the 1990s. We saw billions of people included in the world division of labor that weren't there previously. Bitcoin will mean everything to Africa, to developing economies. It's going to be unbelievable. And the rates of adoption of Bitcoin are going to be astronomical, especially in poor countries. Because if you have a cell phone, and they do have cell phones, they may not have indoor plumbing, they may not have a reliable source of permanently on electricity, but they do have cell phones, they do have generators. And if they have that, then they can be included in the world financial system with Bitcoin, because it's a peer-to-peer exchange network. This means everything for the world's poor. And it means a lot for us, too, because we need their talents. The third thing I'd like to mention in terms of the future, Bitcoin is not a national money. It's not a national system. It is a global system. In that sense, it's just like the gold standard of old. Before the 20th century, we had a global system of monetary exchange. Yes, they had different names for them, but they're all based in the same thing, namely gold. Bitcoin can be that global system again. So we can get rid of these national monies and the vast waste that's associated with constantly changing exchange rates between national currencies. That will not happen. In the future, there'll be one price for Bitcoin, and it'll be global, and it'll integrate us as a global community as nothing ever before. The fourth thing we can look forward to in the Bitcoin space is a further increasing development of the user interfaces themselves. This is a big problem for all of us because the user interfaces are a little bit clunky and they're kind of scary, and there's a lot of problems. I mean, they're much better now than they were 12 months ago, right? The user interfaces. User interfaces are themselves developed by private organizations. This isn't part of Bitcoin. This is part of the infrastructure that's surrounding Bitcoin. Right now, thanks to government's impositions of regulations, so many businesses are having to spend so much time complying with government regulations, they've not had time or energy to improve their user interfaces. But they will be improved in the future. I mean, right now it's a little bit risky to use Bitcoin. I mean, I've done this myself, like sent too much to a person. It's a little weird. Like, I want to send somebody a quarter of a Bitcoin, and I'll send it once, and I'll think, did that actually go through? And then like flake out for a second and send it again, and suddenly discover that the other person has received two. What do you do in that case? Can you charge back? No. You've already moved your property. You have to beg, basically. Can I have my Bitcoin back, actually? You know, it's a little bit scary. So the interfaces will improve, and they'll become ever more secure. I've already talked about Mt. Gox. Thank God they're gone. We've got new exchanges coming along. Finally, I did write down here something about government regulations. You know, there's only so far they can go. There's a senator in the US that announced the other day that Bitcoin should be illegal, all right? This is absurd. This is like saying algebra should be illegal. I mean, you can declare a law against algebra, but good luck enforcing that. It's going to be the same way with Bitcoin. You can abolish it, but it's not going anywhere. Technology always beats those who seem to want to control it. Let me just finally end, and I know I've gone way over my time. Let me finally end, and I would be irresponsible not to mention this, because this is the next level. I mentioned at the outset that Satoshi's protocol consists of three parts: a payment network, a money system, and then finally a system of smart contracting. What the blockchain allows with cryptography is automatically firing contracts between people. So you don't have to use third-party agencies to serve as in an escrow purpose or an enforcement role or anything like that. What it can do is build in a structure of law that also lives and breathes on a peer-to-peer basis. So you can have contractual enforcement between you and anybody else in the world based on this protocol that can be written as part of the blockchain. Because the blockchain does a lot more than just transfer Bitcoins. What it does is it can manage all economic relationships between people with a contractual system. So if you use the system, you're more or less signed up to deliver what you say, and if you don't, then there are penalties associated with that, but no enforcers. What the blockchain holds out is a possibility of law without lawmakers, regulations without regulators, and enforcement without enforcers. This is unbelievable when you consider it. I would strongly encourage you to have a look at a new platform called Ethereum. All right? Just look it up online, watch some of the videos, get a sense of what's coming. We're only just beginning. If you think about the story of the blockchain and Bitcoin as the Bible, you want me to write down the name, Ethereum? Let's see, E-T-H-E-R-E-U-M, okay? Ethereum. It's one of what's going to be many sort of infrastructures. What this allows is the development of smart property and smart contracting within the blockchain itself. As I say, the blockchain is a lot more than Bitcoin. It's about all human relationships itself. Watch some of the videos on Ethereum. You'll see what I'm talking about. It holds out the possibility of a new kind of world economic system. It's absolutely mind-blowing. By the way, the developer of Ethereum himself is a very interesting guy. He's 19 years old. And one of the smartest people you will ever encounter, as you might imagine, slightly socially awkward, actually. It's very interesting to be at conferences with him because he's walking alone, a little bit spacey, and he's followed by about 45, fans. Following him everywhere he goes and peppering him with questions. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. You have to have that kind of mind to think like this. Anyway, I hope I haven't just, given you way too much information. I probably have. I do congratulate you for being on the cutting edge of something unbelievable. As I say, if the story of blockchain is the Bible, we're in Genesis chapter 1 right now, okay? This is just the beginning. We're going to see mind-blowing things in the future. All the governments in the world and their pomps, all the intellectuals and their pretenses are all going to be wiped out in light of this technological revolution. This is the kind of technology that comes along and cannot be stopped. I don't care how many people put it down, try to regulate it, kick it. In the end, Bitcoin is the honey badger of currencies. It really just doesn't care. It's the currency of the future.